Hey everyone, Dorian from Noesis here. It's great to see you again, as always. In today's video, we're going to learn how to use Noesis Studio's powerful templating and styling system to easily create two different button designs that we'll be able to seamlessly apply a multitude of visual styles to. The techniques that we'll be covering today really form the basis of efficiently skinning any interface within Studio, and although we'll be looking at it through the context of buttons, everything that we learn today can be equally applied to all other compatible framework elements. Now before we begin the exercise itself, let's take a brief moment to just go over what exactly templates and styles are and what makes each of them special. My favorite way to illustrate this is to really think of a button, or any other templatable element for that matter, as a room, whose features are defined by its physical construction. And so through this lens, creating a template is really akin to reframing a room whilst leaving its utilities such as plumbing and electrical completely intact. Within Studio, these utilities correspond to the built-in functionality that all of our elements come prepackaged with. And so, just like when creating a room and deciding whether it has windows and doors and where those are placed within the room, within a template, you can also decide which structural elements are included and how they're laid out within them. And what I mean by structural elements is that even the most basic button will usually include a text block and a frame of some sort. These are the internal elements of the template that we're able to modify to our heart's content. Now styles, on the other hand, are akin to decorating a room in a custom theme. The structure of the room stays the same, but you can easily change wallpaper, trim color, and even the look of outlets and switches on the walls without making any changes to any of the functional features that the room's construction offers. Within a UI development context in Studio, these appearance values can be set through a number of slots that every element possesses called properties. One or many of these property values can then be saved as a style. A style can then be applied to any compatible element and easily spread throughout the interface. Now if all of this sounds good, in terms of prep work and materials, all you'll need to follow along are the following. Any 512 by 512 PNG image of your choice, we'll be using a character portrait. Any 512 by 512 semi-transparent PNG pattern or texture, we'll be using a zebra stripe pattern, and of course, the latest copy of Noesis Studio. Once all of that has been assembled, let's get started. Before we launch Studio, let's go ahead and create a nice little place for our creation to live. First, within Windows Explorer, we'll go ahead and create a new folder. Let's name it Button Templates and Styles. Then, within that, we'll create a subfolder. Let's name it Assets. We'll grab the two PNG images we've prepared for this project and place them inside. Let's now open Studio. Within the launcher, we'll go ahead and hit Create New in the upper right hand corner and select the Button Templates and Styles folder we just made. We'll then name this project Button Templates and Styles and press Create Project. This will immediately open the project in the editor. Now, if we look at the Assets panel, we can see that our folder of images has been detected and is available for us to use. We'll just need to create a page where we can start building our buttons. So, let's pop over to the little plus on the right of the Assets panel and select New Page. We'll then just go ahead and rename this to mainpage.xaml, and we're now ready to party. Now if we're going to be having some fun with buttons, we're going to have to bring some into our page. So let's just go ahead and create two rows to lay all of our variants out in. To do this, we'll pop over to the Add Element panel on the far left of the application window, which you can also access by hitting Ctrl and 2 on the keyboard. Once there, we'll do a search for the Stack panel element. And as we'll see in a moment, this is a layout element that, as the name implies, is able to automatically stack children elements either in a vertical or a horizontal orientation without having to manually position each element that we'll be introducing. We'll introduce a first stack panel. Set to a vertical orientation, this will contain our two rows. Then we'll introduce two further stack panels within that. These will display our buttons arranged horizontally. We'll name our first one Row 1 Stack Panel, and we'll name our second one Row 2 Stack Panel. And we'll set each of these to be in a horizontal orientation. Lastly, we'll go ahead and clear all of the preset local dimension values. You can either do this by middle mouse pressing on a field, or from a Properties 3-dot menu and selecting Clear Local Value. We'll also set all of our elements to horizontal and vertical center alignment so that what we build is always centered in the page. Now, for the moment we've all been waiting for. Let's bring some buttons into our page. From the top of the Add Element panel, let's now do a search for the button element. We'll introduce 6 of these into our page, 3 across both of our rows. Let there be buttons. Let's go ahead and set their dimensions to auto. Just like before, I'm using the middle mouse press to clear each of the fields. Now before we continue, let's just zoom in a touch to see things a little bit better. With one of our buttons selected, let's look at the properties that this element offers us. As you can see, we have 3 different slots for colors, some alignment options, and much more. Now, if I go ahead and bring in another button and play with these exact same properties, what we can see is that some of these are actually already functional with the default template. And what is happening here is that we can see that the default template is set up so that the properties that we set at this level, at the page level, actually make changes happen inside of the button itself. These are these internal structural elements that we spoke about earlier. So in this case, for example, the color of the text block inside of this template is actually colored from the foreground property on the outside at the button level. Now, in our case, we don't want to use the default template, and we want to make our own. So before we dive in, let's take a quick look at our visual target and decide which of these button properties we'll make available in our template, so they can act similarly to the default one we just looked at. So we've just briefly popped over to Photoshop where we can see our 2 original button designs in 2 variants each, a yellow banana style and a red apple style. Now, although our 2 button designs are completely different, they do have some commonalities that alter between each style. For example, across both button designs, the banana style contains a yellow key color, whilst apples is red. For this, we can use the button's foreground property. Additionally, in both button designs, the banana style features left-aligned text, whilst apples is center-aligned. For this, we can use the button's horizontal content alignment property. What we'll also notice is that in the jungle design that has the zebra stripes, we have some presentation elements not present in the cyber design, but there are also great candidates to offload to the button's properties. For example, we can use the button's background property to store our special green and off-white colors. As long as nothing in our cyber design uses the background property, it means we can leverage it in our jungle design without any impact to the other. Lastly, we can also use the button's border thickness property to control the fact that in the banana style, we have a little yellow strip on the left of the button, whilst apple has none. Great, so now that we've completed our study, let's jump back into Studio. So now, let's go ahead and start building our first cyber button template. To do so, let's go ahead and right-click on our button. Then, from the context menu, we're going to head to the template section, and from there, under button, let's hit create. In the framework, templates are stored as resources, which makes them easily shareable and spreadable. So as part of this, Studio will ask us what we want to name the resource and where we want to store it. Let's go ahead and name it button, template, cyber. Then we'll elect to store it in our global resources, which makes it accessible from anywhere within the project. Hitting accept will automatically open this template in the inline template editor, which you can see through the magenta stage border. What we can also do is head over to the resources panel on the left of the application window, which we can also invoke with Ctrl and 5 on the keyboard. And there we can see that our resource has been created. Now if we look at the navigator panel in the bottom left of the window and we expand the hierarchy, we can see that we already have some content pre-populated, including an element named a content presenter. Now we're going to remove this and replace it with our own elements, but before we do, let's just briefly touch on what this is. Basically, a content presenter within a button template allows it to serve as a physical slot to hold any elements placed inside the button wherever it's used. Now it's worth noting that although we're talking about this in the context of a button in particular, the same system applies equally to all elements containing a content property and featuring a content presenter within their template. So to see exactly how this works, let's just jump outside the template by clicking on the home icon and the breadcrumb in the upper left of the stage, and I'll show you what I mean. So looking at what we have on screen, in this case, what is rendering the text within this button is actually the content presenter. And content presenters offer a unique feature in that if you type a text string into the content property of an element containing one, it'll automatically be interpreted as text and be visible on the button, as we can see here. However, beyond this, its real party trick is you can actually put entire hierarchies as the button's content. So, for example, let's wipe the text. And in its place, we'll head to the Add Element panel and pop some elements into our button, and we can see that we can lay them out within the button himself, completely in line. Now, whilst this is an amazing feature for inline population of the element, the one downside is that a content presenter doesn't give access to all of the same properties that more specific elements would, which is where we're going to remove it and replace it with our own construction. So let's just put the original content value back in, and then we'll right click on our button again, and from the templates category, we'll once again head to the button submenu, but this time we'll select edit, and this will reopen the template in the template editor. So to start, let's go ahead and delete that content presenter we talked about by right clicking on it, heading to the edit category, and then hitting delete. Or as a shortcut, we can also do this by just selecting the element and pressing delete on the keyboard. Next, we can see that we have a border element here. This is a great element with lots of neat features, but one restriction that the border has is that it can only contain one child. So let's go ahead and change it to a grid element that'll give us a bit more flexibility. We can really easily convert it by right-clicking on it, and then under the layout category, if we go to the replace with subsection, we can then select grid. Awesome. Let's go ahead and just rename this by double-clicking on it and typing master_grid. Let's also just go ahead and set some of its physical metrics. We'll set the width to 400, the height to 240, and the margin to 32 all around. Let's also just go ahead and add a drop shadow to this element by heading to the appearance section and selecting drop shadow effect from the effect property dropdown. Now at this point, we're going to set up our very first binding by hovering over the drop shadow's color property and selecting create binding from its 3-dot menu. What we want to achieve here is for the color of the drop shadow to mirror whatever color is set as the foreground property of the button itself. So to demonstrate what I mean, let's exit the template by clicking on the home icon in the top left, and then we'll simply identify the button's foreground property. Whatever value is set in the slot is where we'll point the drop shadow to get its color from. Let's jump back into the template. So to set the color of the drop shadow use the button's foreground value, we'll return to our drop shadow's binding, and we'll first want to ensure that the relative tab is selected. Relative basically allows you to point to either the selected element itself or to a parent element. In our case, we're inside the template, and so our parent is the button element itself. What we can then do is to click the button directly to the right of the path field, and we'll get a list of all the properties of the button that we're able to bind to. In our case, we're going to head down to foreground, and one small item to be aware of here is that the drop shadow's color is set by a color and not by a color brush. And so, in this specific case, we need to expand foreground and select color instead of the foreground, which is a color brush. And before we move on from our drop shadow, let's just go ahead and put in a couple additional properties to shape its appearance. We'll set the shadow depth to 0, the direction to 0, the opacity to 75, and the blur radius to 24. Now, there will be two things you'll notice after we set this up. First, you'll see that a color is now visible inside of the drop shadow's color field. Now what is this and where is it coming from? Well, until we overwrite the foreground property on the button with the values from our own styles or a locally set one, Studio will use the values of the Noesis default button style, which in this case serves an off-white color in the property for the foreground slot. Now, the next thing you'll also notice is that we're actually not seeing this drop shadow around our frame. Now, this is simply because the frame is devoid of content, and you can't cast a shadow on something that isn't there. Fear not, however, as this will be automatically resolved once we start adding in content to our template. So let's go ahead and pop back over to our Add Element panel. From there, we'll go ahead and search for a grid element. Once identified, we'll drag and drop one of these into our hierarchy. Once introduced, we'll then rename it to background_grid. Then, we'll go ahead and do a search for the border element. Once found, we'll then bring in 3 of these right into the background grid. Then, we'll name them from top to bottom, image_border, image tint_border, and image gradient_border. To continue our configuration, let's work our way down, starting with the image. This will contain our character portrait as the background property, so let's go ahead and pop that open, select our image, and set it stretch to uniform to fill so that it always stays nice and proportional. And just as we do that, you'll also see that our drop shadow has appeared as a glow. Very fancy and very cool. Now before we move on to the next element, let's go ahead and just clear the border value by middle mouse pressing on the field. We'll also just go ahead and unlock our corner radius to be able to input individual values, and we'll go ahead and set that to 8, 8, 0, 0. Wonderful. Let's move on to the image tint. And very similarly to how we use the button's foreground color as the color of the drop shadow, we'll also have the tint derive its color from the same foreground property served by the button. So we'll go ahead and hover over the background property and select Create Binding from the 3-dot menu. We'll ensure that Relative and Templated Parent are selected, and then we'll find and select the foreground entry in this list. In this case, the background property can use a color brush directly, so we're good to just select foreground without expanding it and selecting foreground/color like we had to do with the drop shadow's color. Lastly, let's just go ahead and set its remaining properties. We'll set the image tint's opacity to 25%. We'll go ahead and middle mouse press to clear the border. And then lastly, we'll set the border's corner radius to be able to be set individually. Then we'll enter 8, 8, 0, 0 to round its top left and top right corners. Let's now move on to our image gradient, and we'll just go ahead and create a really simple gradient that goes from black at the bottom to faded out at the top. This will give us a nice little background to help with the visibility of the text that we'll be placing in the bottom third of the button. So let's go ahead and pop open the background property, and we'll then select the linear gradient brush tab. We'll ensure that our first gradient stop is set to be black with 100% transparency, and that our second stop is a completely opaque black, completing the fade effect. After that, we can then go ahead and close the panel. Next, we'll clear the border values by middle mouse pressing over any of its fields, and lastly, we'll also set its corner radius to be the same as the image tint, with individual entries and set to 8, 8, 0, 0. We're now all done with our background, and so we can go ahead and collapse the background grid and move on to adding a content area as our next step. To start, let's pop over to the Add Element panel and grab ourselves a border element. We'll then place this inside of the master grid just under the background grid, and we'll call this content_border. Now what we're going to want to do here is to have our border's stroke get its color from the button's foreground property. So just as before, we'll create a binding from the border properties 3-dot menu. We'll set it to Relative, Templated Parent, and then select Foreground from the list. Great. With that done, let's go ahead and collapse this and just set a couple remaining properties. We'll go ahead and set the border thickness to be edited as individual, and then we'll set the value to 2, 2, 2, 16, which will give it an outline with a nice chunky bottom edge. We'll then also set our corner radius to individual, then set its value to 8, 8, 0, 0 to match the profile of our other borders. Great. From the Add Element panel, let's now go ahead and grab a grid, and we'll pop it into the content border and name it content_grid. Next, from the Add Element panel again, we'll then find a text block element. We'll put this into our content grid and we'll call it label_text block. Now what we want this text block to do is that we want to reflect the content that is present in the button's content property. By default, this will be the word button. So if we do the exact same binding process we've done with our colors so far, we can go to the text block's text property, click on the 3-dot menu, and create a binding to the button's content property. And then bam, just like that, the default word button appears. And just to show how this is working, we'll exit the template by clicking the home button in the upper left, and now if we go ahead and change the text in the content field, you can see that it takes effect on the text block inside. Let's re-enter the template for our next step. Now one really awesome thing we can easily do in Studio is to set our text to follow a certain casing. So if we expand the section under the binding path selector, we can find a converter property from where we can select a case converter and select lowercase. This will allow us to always ensure that no matter what text is input, it will always render in all lowercase. With that done, let's go ahead and collapse all of this. Now another thing we can do is to bind the horizontal alignment property so that the horizontal alignment of the text corresponds to the button's horizontal content alignment property. To do this, we'll find the horizontal alignment property, and then in the same way as we've done before, we'll create a binding, select Relative, Templated Parent, and then we'll bind this property to the button's horizontal content alignment property in the list. You want to be very careful here to select horizontal content alignment and not horizontal alignment. As the name implies, the content alignment is for the element's content, whereas horizontal alignment is for the parent button element itself relative to the layout it exists within. we'll also just set the color to be the button's foreground property color. Just like we've done before a couple times already, from the properties 3-dot menu, we'll select create binding, relative, templated parent, and then select foreground. Let's also give this text block a little glow. So, as we're used to doing, we'll set a drop shadow effect. Then we'll bind its color to the button's foreground/color. Once we're done creating the binding, we'll then set the drop shadow's properties to shadow depth 0, direction 0, and blur radius 24. Last thing for this text block, let's go ahead and polish up the presentation. We'll unlock its margin and set it to individual, then input 16, 16, 0, and 8. We'll set its vertical alignment to bottom, and then we'll scroll down the properties list, and in the text format section, we'll set the text family to Old English text, and we'll also give it a nice big size of 50. Now for our final touch. From the Add Element panel, let's search for a star element and drag it into the navigator directly below the text block. After it's been put in place, we'll rename it to arrow_star, because we'll be using our procedural controls to make this star shape into an arrow shape. But first, let's go ahead and just recolor it to use our button's foreground color. So, on its fill property, we'll create a binding using relative, templated parent, and then we'll select foreground. Next, we'll also give it a little glow by selecting the drop shadow effect. Then, on its color property, we'll create a binding, and as we're used to doing by now, relative, templated parent, and then selecting foreground/color. Lastly, we'll then set its shadow depth to 0, its direction to 0, and its blur radius to 24. At this point, let's go ahead and use our procedural shape controls to transform this star into an arrow tucked into the top right corner of the tile. We'll set its count to 3, its ratio to 0.5, its width to 28, its height to 16, its horizontal alignment to right, its vertical alignment to top. We'll go ahead and middle mouse press on the stroke field to clear its stroke, and then under the transform section, under the layout transform category, we'll set its rotation angle to 45. How cool is that? We are now done creating our very first template. So let's exit the inside of this template by clicking on the home icon in the top left and head back to our page. Next, let's just go ahead and zoom out a bit to give us a bird's eye view. At this point, we can easily apply this template to our entire first row. We can do this by right-clicking on any button and in the context menu, navigating to Templates, Button, and then selecting our desired template, and bam, it's instantly applied. Now it's also useful to know that this is also something you can do from the navigator in the exact same way, simply by right-clicking on any compatible element on the list and going through the exact same workflow. Or, as another alternative, if you prefer using the Properties panel, you can also first select an element and then navigate to the button's Properties panel, from where under the Templating section, you can then select the desired template from the drop-down menu under the Template property. Nice and easy either way. Now let's take a moment to show off and prove that the bindings we set up in the template are indeed working and being controlled by the button's properties. So if, for example, we select one of our buttons and click on its foreground property and then we change its color, we can see that all of the elements we bound to the button's foreground are all adjusting in sync. How neat is that, eh? Let's go ahead and revert that for now, because instead of manually inputting these values for each and every button, we'll create a style that will control these. To do this, we'll go ahead and right-click on our button, and this time, instead of the Templates section, we'll head to the Styles category. Then, under Button, we'll select Create. Styles, just like templates, are also synced as resources, so we'll go ahead and name this Button, Style, Banana, and then save it to our Global Resources Dictionary. And the moment we create this, will be put into the Style inline editor, as we can see from the orange border all around the stage. You'll also notice that the navigator is empty, and that's because in a style, all of the action happens in the Properties panel. So let's pop on over there and set the values that this style will pass on to whatever it's applied to. We'll go ahead and first set the horizontal content alignment to left, so that in this style, our text label will always be left aligned. Once again, always be mindful that horizontal alignment and horizontal content alignment are different things. Once we're done with that, we'll also set the foreground property for this style, and we'll just set it to FF EB AB 00, which will produce a nice yellow. And what you will see magically happen is that the moment we confirm this value, all of the areas where we set our foreground bindings inside of our template are now being colored by the yellow value passed through by the style. Now, before we leave this style, let's go ahead and also just put in the values we know will be used in our second jungle template that we'll be making in a moment. This way, we can directly apply this style to a button and enjoy the results immediately. We'll set the background property to FF70A503, and this will be for the green background color only present in the second template that we'll be making. And then we'll also unlock its border thickness and set it to individual, then give it a thickness of 16,000, which will also be exclusive to the second template and will give it a thick yellow strip on its left. With that done, let's go ahead and exit the style by clicking on the home icon in the top left, and we'll repeat similar steps for the second apple style that we'll be creating next. So exactly like we just did for the banana style, let's go ahead and right click on the last button of the row. Then, from the Styles context menu category under Button, we'll select Create. In the pop-up, we'll name it Button, Style, Apple, then press Accept. Now we can go ahead and set our foreground property for this style. So we'll go ahead and click on the field, and in the pop-up under Solid Color Brush, we'll input FF, 8F, 1C, 1A, which will give us our red color. And that's all it took to impose a completely different colorway to our button. Easy as. Now let's go ahead and exit our style, and we'll return to the page where we'll create our second button template. Before we dig in, let's first go ahead and get back up close and personal. Then we'll go ahead and right click on one of the buttons in the second row. With the context menu open, just like when we created our previous template, we can navigate through to Templates, Button, and then hit Create. We'll go ahead and name this one Button, Template, Jungle. Once we're happy with that, we can press Accept, which will save it as a resource, and now that we're in the inline template editor, we can start the construction process. So let's kick things off with some demolition work. We're going to go ahead and select the built-in content presenter found under the background border in the navigator, and then hit Delete to remove it. Next, let's go ahead and rename the root element to master_border. Nice, let's continue, and we'll head to the Add Element panel for our next step. From there, we'll search for, then introduce a grid element to our hierarchy. Once dragged in, we'll immediately rename it to content_grid. Now from the Add Element panel once again, we'll search for a border element. We'll then click and drag 3 of these into our content grid. Once in place, let's go ahead and name them from top to bottom. Background color _border, background pattern _border, and label _border. Next, from the Add Element panel again, let's also bring in a text block element. We'll place it within the label border, and we'll also take a moment to name it label_text block. Perfect, we're all set up, and now we can configure all of these little pieces of excitement. Let's start by selecting our master border. Then, we'll head over to its properties panel on the right of the window where we can get it all set up. From there, we'll set its width to 400, its margin to 32 all around, its horizontal alignment to center, its vertical alignment to center. We'll go ahead and clear its padding values. We'll also clear its background, and we'll do the same for the corner radius too. Then we'll head down to the transform section. Under the Layout Transform Skew tab, we'll set its angle X to -16. This will give a nice skew to the entire button and all of its contents. Next, we'll also bind this element's border property to the button's foreground property. So we'll go ahead and create binding, relative, templated parent, and then find and select foreground from the list. Great, let's collapse that. Next, we'll also apply a binding to the element's border thickness property to the button's border thickness property. So create binding, relative, templated parent, and then bam, border thickness. Lastly, let's go ahead and give this element a hard drop shadow. And we'll give it a shadow depth of 8, a direction of 220, and a blur radius of 0. With the master border done, let's move on to background color border, and all we'll do here is bind its background to mirror the value of the button's background property. So, with the element selected, from the background properties 3-dot menu, we'll then select create binding and ensure that relative and templated parent are selected. We'll then click the icon next to the path entry and simply select background from the list, and that'll be it. Moving on to the background pattern border, in this case, we'll go ahead and populate its background with our pattern PNG. So we'll click on its background property, and then from the pop-up, we'll just navigate to the image brush tab. From there, under the image source option, we can find and select our bitmap. Then, just to make sure this always displays nice and proportionally, we'll set its stretch mode to uniform to fill. There we go, that's much better. Let's close this and continue. Next, let's select label border, and we're going to bind its horizontal alignment property to the horizontal content alignment property of the button. This will allow the two different alignment modes of both of our styles to affect the position of our label, with the banana style left aligning it and the apple style center aligning it. So, under horizontal alignment, create binding, relative, templated parent, and then we'll select horizontal content alignment from the list. As always, beware to pick horizontal content alignment and not horizontal alignment. Great, we can now close that and continue. Next in line, let's hit up label text block. The first thing we're going to do here is to make this text reflect whatever string is written into the button's content property field. So, under the three-dot menu of its text property, let's hit create binding. Ensuring that relative and templated parent are selected, we'll then expand the list and select content. Next, we'll do the opposite of what we did in our other button template, and this time, instead of setting it to always render in all lowercase, let's set this text to always render in all uppercase. To do that, we'll expand the section just below the path listing, and under converter, we'll select case converter. Then, we'll just ensure that uppercase is selected in the format field. Lastly, we'll of course want to give this text a custom color informed by the style, so we'll go ahead and bind its foreground to our button's foreground property. So let's collapse the text entry, head to the foreground property, and from its three-dot menu, we'll select create binding. Then, under relative, templated parent, we'll just select foreground, and that'll be it. Beautiful. With all of our binding work now done, let's do a rapid-fire round of setting properties across many of our elements to get this looking exactly how we want it to. We'll start with background color border. We'll clear its border, and then we'll also clear its border thickness property. We'll then drop down to background pattern border and we'll do the exact same thing. We'll first clear its border, and then we'll also clear its border thickness. Continuing with label border, let's give it a margin of 24 all around. We'll also set its background to be an opaque black with a value of FF000000. Then we'll clear its border too. And we'll also clear its border thickness just like we did with the previous two elements. Last but not least, we'll select label text block. We'll set its margin to two-sided, then we'll input 5 in the first left-right entry, and then -3 in the second top-bottom entry. This will center it nicely within the label border. Then, to finish things off, we'll just scroll down to the text format section of the properties, and from there, we'll set this text block to use the text family of Berlin Sans FB. We'll also bulk it up a bit by giving it a text size of 48, and we'll also change its weight to a demi-bold. With that, we are now done creating our second template. We can now exit this view and return to our page. And now, just like we did with our first row, we can now use the context menu to apply our new template to our entire bottom row of buttons. Let's zoom out so that our page fills the stage. Then, let's select the first button in the bottom row, and from the right-click context menu under Templates, Button, let's pick the Jungle template. Boom. Let's just go ahead and also repeat that for our third button in the bottom row. What we can do directly after that is we can also apply our banana and apple styles in the same positions as they're in our first row. So let's select the middle button of the second row, right-click, navigate to Styles, Button, and then Banana. And just like that, it's instantly brought to life. We'll repeat the exact same operation on the third button, but this time, instead of selecting the banana style, we'll select the apple style to color it red. And bam, just like that, that's all it takes. Now, as we're looking at this, what we may notice, however, is that in our second button template spanning across the bottom row, in the apple style, we're missing our nice beige background that was originally in our visual target. Now, because of how we set things up, we can adjust this super easily and bring it in line. So, let's go ahead and pop open our apple style and provide it with this beige color in its background slot. To do so, we'll right-click on the third button, and from its context menu, we'll navigate to Styles, Button, and then we'll just ensure that the style we want to modify is indeed the one that's applied. We can see that it's using the correct style, so now we can just hit Edit, and it'll transport us into the style editor with the orange stage border. Now all that we've got to do here is to click on the style's background property and input our desired value of FF, A8, AD, 9B. We can see here that as soon as we enter this, the beige color has now come through behind the panel. Let's close this picker to get a better look. Perfect. So now let's exit the style and admire our work. What a lovely set of buttons we have here. Before we sign off, let's first have a bit of fun with this and validate the work that we did together. To do so, we'll be bringing in a new button and show off how modularly and seamlessly our templates and styles work together. We'll just pop over the Add Element panel and search for a button. Let's drag this into our first stack panel. Since this stack panel is in a vertical orientation, introducing this new button to it will add it as a third row in our layout. And now what we can do is that we can pretty much instantaneously swap between both templates and both styles without any impact to the content of the button. To further demonstrate this, let's go ahead and change the text of our button and see how it always conserves this content whilst the entire aesthetic of the element changes around it. From this little test, we can see that everything is working beautifully just as we intended. And that's it. That's how easy it is to work with the foundations of templating and styling. Although we looked at this exercise in the context of a button, Noesis Studio comes absolutely jam-packed with an enormous array of elements that all follow the exact same mechanics and will allow you to ensure consistency across your entire UI, as well as unlocking the ability to easily transition from gray block into high fidelity, or, just as excitingly, to reskin an entire UI from one style to another without impacting any of the currently existing functionality. We hope you found this useful, enjoyable, and empowering. If you have any questions, requests, or want to know about anything else, drop by our forums anytime, and we'd love to continue the fun there. Thank you so much once again for joining, and we'll see you next time.